Hey friends, you're listening to the Hope and Hard Pills podcast, where we are talking about practical insight for racial justice and social change. I'm your host, Andre Henry, and joining me from North Carolina is my co-host, Alicia T. Crosby. How you doing, Alicia?
Hey, Andre. I am doing relatively well, but I'm really pumped about this. Yeah, it is, because there's well and there's relatively well. It's like we try to be authentic around these parts, but I can say with full gusto that I'm excited about this interview that we're going to be sharing with you this week. So this week's guest is Rob Lee, which may sound familiar to some of y'all, and for others that may be a new name, but pretty much all of us know who Robert E. Lee is. Mm-hmm. American history books and history classes don't spare detail in sharing about this Confederate general. Uh-huh. And so for this week of Hope and Hard Pills, we've actually interviewed one of his great multiply that nephews, who's actually really dedicated to the work of anti-racism.
Yes.
This is fascinating. Looking at a descendant from this Confederate general who is like really entrenched in like this work of anti-racism and anti-oppression. I think it's going to make for a really good conversation.
Yeah, I was really excited to talk with Reverend Rob Lee because, well, for several reasons, but one reason is because sometimes we have this conversation about how it's white people's responsibility to confront white supremacy. And I feel like Rob is actually doing that in a very like clear way. Like not many of us can say like my great, or, however many greats grandfather or granduncle like was a prominent Confederate general. And to see the way that he is confronting that legacy of white supremacy, I just thought it's very interesting and also pretty inspiring, especially when we talk about things like white guilt and, generational stuff.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I met Rob at a Martin Luther King Jr. Birthday celebration last year. I think it was 2018. And he spoke, and next thing you know, I saw him on MTV. And he kind of left his church over his stance against white supremacy after the Charlottesville riot. So, I just had to talk to him. Okay, so we have been usually sending you to a song before the interview, but I've heard that cuffing season is over.
It is. Cuffing season is over. We are in December. And for those of you who are celebrating the holidays with people who are not your boo things, you've let these other people go. So there is no song, there is no cuff, because people are...
Because you should be cuffed by now. Is that what you're saying? You said people should be cuffed by now?
You should be cuffed. And if like you are not in a place of wanting to commit to the cuff, then you've let people go, because otherwise you're going to have to buy them holiday presents.
That's right. There are so many breakups this time of year because, okay, first off, there are a lot of engagements this time of year, and there are a lot of breakups this time of year.
Mm-hmm.
I guess people are trying to get out of buying Christmas presents. I wonder how many people break up and get engaged this season. Like some people break up with who they're dating so that they can go and propose to someone else.
Okay, that is trash. That is trash ass behavior.
See, these are the questions that go through my head, and I'm gonna end up like in some internet rabbit hole tonight trying to figure out like how many people.
No one's doing statistical work around this. I almost promise you. Like, I will bet you $1 no one is doing statistical analysis on like breakup, makeup, engagement theory. Like, no, Andre.
You never know. You never know.
Lord.
No, it doesn't have to be. Doesn't have to be this way. Doesn't have to be. No, it doesn't have to be this way.
Hi, Rob. How's it going?
It's going. How are you?
I'm doing really well. I'm so glad that that you're on the show. I'm glad that we worked it out. You're here. I'm here, and I'm super excited to talk to you about your work and your story.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
Oh yeah, my pleasure. So, I first saw you at Dr. King's birthday celebration. I think it was last year in 2018 when you spoke. And it was so compelling to me to hear about your story of being a pastor, a descendant of one of the most famous Civil War Confederate generals, and that you're taking a stand against white supremacy and speaking up about that legacy. Then the next time I saw you was on MTV. And I don't know, I just when I thought about who should be in this conversation around anti-racism, I thought, oh, we've got to talk to Rob Lee because he knows from a white person's perspective, from someone who can look into his family line and see people who fought for the Confederacy. Like that's just a unique angle to speak from. So could you just share some of that story? Did you leave the church after you spoke up about white supremacy after Charlottesville?
Well, I think one of the things that I think about when it comes to being a Lee is I grew up, going to DC and being in Arlington and seeing all that stuff, especially around July 4th when we're
Mm-hmm.
talking right now. And it was so amazing to see the history and the veneration of Robert E. Lee. So I've carried that name with me for some time.
Mm-hmm.
And then MTV called and said, we need you to use your name for a very particular purpose of calling out white supremacy
Mm-hmm.
in our time.
Yeah.
And I did that, and it caused some backlash with the church.
Yeah.
And I ended up leaving and leaving my post there. And that was really hard. And it's been a long 2 years of reckoning with that heritage and that lineage, but also with my reality of being a pastor and not having a church and trying to find my own way in this
Yeah.
world when everything seems to be taken from you. But I'm also clear that it's pales in comparison to what people of color experience every day, whether that's in the
Mm-hmm.
workplace or elsewhere. There is some real pain that is going on in our country that needs to be addressed and needs to be faced.
Hmm. Yeah, you mentioned, that you've carried that name your whole life. Obviously, we all carry our names for most of our lives, but I don't think it even really sat on me until you said that. And I wonder, how did you carry that legacy beforehand? Like, what was your relationship to, that whole part of your family history growing up?
You know, every generation has to deal with their own history and their own lineage, but mine seems to be a little more pervasive and a little more
Mm.
insidious. And
Mm-hmm.
so I've had to deal with the heritage of my ancestors in a way that not other people have had to deal with. And
Mm-hmm.
so I really think about what does it mean to be a Lee in the 21st century.
Mm.
I was proud. I'm not going to lie. I was proud to be a Lee for the fact that it's a big part of our history when
Yeah.
I was younger. But as
Mm-hmm.
I've grown, as I've learned, as I've sat with people that are important to me, like Dr. Bernice King, who I
Yeah.
met at the Martin Luther King celebration you mentioned earlier,
Mm-hmm.
I've learned that names carry a weight that you can use
Yeah.
for immense good or
Yeah.
you can use for immense harm. I
Mm-hmm.
also think of the Iroquois tradition of the seventh generation principle, the idea
Mm-hmm.
that our what we're doing now affects 7 generations down the line, and I'm a testament that that is true. What
Wow.
Robert E. Lee did affected me and countless others, um,
Hmm.
and so I have to kind of live with that and hold on to that, but also give voice to it because
Yeah.
if I don't give voice to it, other people will. And that's
Yeah.
really dangerous in the current climate that we live in and face as in this country, especially.
Yeah. As you say that, I think about the recent reparations hearing that happened in DC. I was actually there in DC for this past meeting that they had, this hearing they had on reparations. And one of the things that a couple of the witnesses said was, no, and Mitch McConnell said the day before too, is that no one living today was around, during the time of slavery, or there's this whole notion in our country that these things are in our past. And I wonder how you, like, how you relate to these kinds of statements when you hear them on the news and when people say them. Like, what do you think about when you hear that kind of thing?
Well, I think about how we celebrate things like the American Revolution, and that's further removed from us than slavery.
Mm-hmm.
We mark and commemorate events that happened 2 millennia ago every Sunday,
Mm-hmm.
and yet we refuse to acknowledge an event that happened less than 200 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
Um, one of the things I try and talk about in my talks that I give when I go across the country and talk about this stuff with anti-racism training is we
Mm-hmm.
never really killed Jim Crow
Mm.
after the failed Reconstruction. We just gave him a different name.
Yes.
We call him something else now. This is the stuff that Mitch McConnell is engaged in. This is the stuff that people are engaged in when they say that it's our history and we need to ignore it, or we need
Mm-hmm.
to not reparate for the sins of the past. Um, we have to acknowledge our past if we want to get to a better future. And
Mm.
my seminary professor would say that history doesn't repeat itself. Well, I would argue that it does rhyme. Some of
Mm.
the things that
Mm-hmm.
we're experiencing today um, are reminiscent of what we experienced in the past, and that's really scary to me.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, when we think about, a couple years ago, these folks that were marching the streets with the tiki torches in their hand, and to defend like this statue, talk about living in the past. Like America is always reaching back into its history, right?
Well,
Like just
yeah, sorry. The scary thing about that is, like, those kids were our age. They weren't much older than me. Some of them
mm-hmm.
were younger than me, and that's scary.
Yeah,
You know,
yeah,
that's scary in a way that we can't really fully comprehend, because people are saying, "Oh, racism is dying. Racism is going to be dead." No, these were kids that were my age, that were marching
mm,
in Charlottesville.
yeah. Yeah, and what do you think that we should do with that history? Like I mean, obviously you've already pointed to, we need to look at our history because it does inform our present and it does inform the future. But you have people who look at these monuments and go like, you're trying to erase our history and our culture. What do you think we should do with these Confederate statues and these vestiges of the Confederacy? I mean, on this day, I don't know when we're going to air this, but on this day, that people are arguing about the Betsy Ross version of the American flag. you know?
Yeah, yeah.
So what do we do with these symbols, do you think?
Well, I look at it this way. As a pastor, I see them as idolatrous.
Mm-hmm.
Because whether or not they were, we can have this argument all day long till we're blue in the face about whether they were meant for commemoration of the Civil War dead or whatever. We can have that argument if we want to. But ultimately, they've become idols of white supremacy. And so they need to come down, first of all, especially in public places that are facing and, where people might vote. I mean, like, think about that. There's a place in my
Mm,
hometown where it's a polling station's right down the street from a Confederate memorial.
mm,
Think about what that says about our nation and where our
right,
values are. That
right.
we value a statue more than we value the ballot. That's
Mm,
dangerous.
yeah,
That's really pernicious behavior on the part of white Christians who
yeah,
claim to be, well-off, well-meaning people who are
yeah,
more willing to fight for a statue or for the Confederate flag to fly than they
mm,
are for people to vote.
yeah, yeah.
And I don't want to get on my soapbox, but I think that we need to hear more of this from white pulpits too,
Mm,
especially progressive white pulpits, because ultimately the pulpit is inherently political, and it's
right.
something that we have to face. I mean, if you look at the back through the history of our nation, some of the most you know awe-inspiring moments have come when preachers have stood up and said, "I have a dream," or
Yeah,
stuff like that. They incorporated their theology into the public square. And so, and
yeah,
it doesn't just have to be preachers; it can be lay people too. I mean, there's plenty of
right.
stuff going on that we need to have an engaged church, an engaged
Mm-hmm.
electorate, and engaged citizenry.
Yeah, yeah. When I think of Germany during World War II, and I think of how the church was so complicit with the Nazi Party, but you also had, Christians who were more in kind of a liberation strain, right? Like the confessing church, right?
Yeah,
And I think about, that. Well, actually, I raised this to someone. He's he works at Yale Divinity School, and his response to me was, "Well, the presence of the confessing church didn't stop the Holocaust." And ever since we had that conversation, it just has stuck with me, and so I keep mulling that over. So thank you for weighing in on that too. Like I just keep mulling over, like, is can better theologies that liberate people, faith that is focused on helping the widow and the orphan, um, can it be a kind of antidote, to the faith that supports the status quo or that is oppressive and all that? And I don't know. I don't know.
Well, Sam Wells, who is the former dean of Duke Chapel and is now vicar at St. Martin's in the Field in Trafalgar Square,
Mm-hmm.
um, he had this wonderful line that I loved. It says, "If it can't be happy, make it beautiful."
Mm,
Nothing about racism or xenophobia or the Holocaust can be happy. There is nothing happy about that.
right.
Our response to it, how we wake up the next morning and pick up the pieces, how we stop it from happening in the first place and saying never again, that can be
Mm,
beautiful. I
yes.
don't think we'll ever solve the problem of evil. And if you
Yeah.
do, we can write a really good book. I don't think people have tried, but I think our
Yeah.
response can be really beautiful and really healthy to these evils that exist, so that one day we can look back and say, you know what, we gave it our best, we did what we could, we
Right.
have fought the good fight. You know,
Mm, yeah. Speaking of really good books, you recently released one, "A Sin by Another Name," Reckoning. Oh gosh, I just okay. I'm going to get the subtitle right. "A Sin by Another Name: Reckoning with Racism and the Heritage of the South." Tell us about the book.
so the book is a memoir with a mission, is what I called it in the book.
Hmm.
It's an attempt to kind of reconcile my past with God's future. Because I grew up, even though my parents are very progressive people, I
Hmm.
grew up with them letting me form my own opinions about General Robert E. Lee, who is a distant uncle.
Hmm.
And that was a really problematic thing for me later on as I grew up. And thank God for a few women of color who I talk about in the book, who are courageous enough to give of their time and talent and effort to help me see the problems that I faced as a Lee in the South.
Mm.
Um, and I want to say here that it's not incumbent upon people of color to help me fix my junk, but thank God that they were willing to call me out and help me see
Mm.
a beautiful reminder of who I am as a person beyond just my name. So this book is that reckoning with that name and that legacy.
Mm.
Down here in the South, if I pull out my credit card at a gas station or at a home improvement store, people will say the South will rise again when they see the name.
Oh my
Um,
gosh.
yeah, I do. I feel like you want to be in the book where it happens. And you know, people say racism's dead. That's not true at all. Um, or it's dying. No, it's not. There are plenty of good, people out here who are trying to bring it back or make it more obvious.
Mm.
So this book isn't a love letter, but it's also a tough love letter. It's one
Yeah.
saying that I'm not going to put up with the mess anymore. We've got to fix this. We've got to change ourselves to be better for a better tomorrow.
Yeah. That is awesome. And also terrifying that people say
Oh
that to
yeah.
you.
Oh yeah.
Oh my gosh. Okay, so I have a question that I think that some of our listeners will really appreciate. So half of the folks that are already a part of our community, this is growing. About half of our folks are white,
Yeah.
and so I get a lot of questions, about helping white people. And like you said, it's not incumbent upon people of color to do that. And yeah, I try to be helpful, but I also think that there's a certain degree to where I actually can't help white people be better people, right?
Yeah.
Because in the same way that they can't get inside my experience, I may know a lot about being white from, just growing up in a society where you're basically you need to know about being white. Everyone has to know about being white. But I still don't know what it's like to be identified as a white person. And so I thought I could ask you some of those questions.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and that's, I mean, to your point, white people have got to get our own people. We can't just
Yeah.
sit around and just pretend like it's going to happen. We've got to do some work ourselves.
Right.
You
Right.
know,
Right. So I'm wondering specifically, how do you deal with white guilt? Because, or have you dealt with it? I'm just assuming that you have. So, I mean, I don't even know that you have, but maybe you know others that do. Because I do have one friend who, like you, he can trace in his genealogy, like he knows like a great uncle or something like that owned slaves or something. And I've seen him beat himself up over this a lot. And myself and other black and people of color that I know, like we just kind of freeze in that moment because I I don't know how to comfort you,
well, you shouldn't
and it's
either.
not my job to comfort you,
Yeah,
right? Like
yeah.
so I'm not even gonna try. But so it's just like, I mean, good luck with that. So anyway, how do you deal with white guilt? How do you talk to other white people about white guilt?
Well, white guilt is problematic, but it's
Hmm.
also a natural emotion. I think for people who want to fix things like I do,
Yeah.
um, it's very natural to feel this like, oh my gosh, I can't believe my family did this, or I
Mm.
can't believe I said that the way I said it earlier at dinner last night. There's there's some real emotional weight there that needs to be worked through.
Yeah.
Um, so one, get a good therapist who you can pay to listen to you
Mm.
with your problems. But two, I think also recognize that white guilt pales in comparison to the pain and suffering that people of color go through every single day of their lives.
Yeah.
Because we make this white guilt into this big, grandiose problem. Woe is me, woe is me, woe is me. But the
Hmm.
real reality of people suffering is different than guilt.
Mm.
So I
Hmm.
think that we have to acknowledge the place that the guilt has.
Yeah.
I don't want to say it's unnatural because I don't think it is, but I think we
Yeah.
have to acknowledge its natural place in our cultural conversation, but also in our personal and professional conversations as well.
Mm.
Because it's like a hierarchy, right? A hierarchy of guilt, or of needs and guilt and feelings. There's some real feelings that need to be addressed, sure, but
Right.
they need to be addressed in the proper space and also in the proper context. Context is
Yeah.
key in these conversations.
Hmm. Yeah, for sure. And I think I already did. So if this feels redundant, then Ross can just take it out. But no, I think we already covered that because we've already talked about like folks who are like, well, I mean, I wasn't there. Like, it's not me. Like, it's
Yeah.
the extreme defensiveness, right?
Well, they benefit from systems, even if their parents didn't, parents, grandparents, have a clean slate back to Adam and Eve themselves, they still benefit from systems. They still benefit from systems, and that's something that we've got to address.
Yeah, yeah, so true. Well, what are you up to these days? What are you working on now?
Well, I have worked and am working on a book on faith and mental health and how the church
Mm-hmm.
can address that.
Mm-hmm.
I think it plays in well with this conversation because, I've had experiences when I was, hospitalized for my bipolar, where
Yeah.
as a white person, I received better medical care than the people of color around me, and it was noticeable, not
Wow.
only by me but by the people of color in the room with me.
Really?
Um,
What kind? Can you give me an example?
Well, I was at a hospital when I was in seminary, and the
Mm-hmm.
seminary was attached to the hospital in the sense of they were, in the same organization. And the nurse came in and said, "Well, we take care of our own here since you're a student." And I got ahead of the rest of the people that were waiting in line to get a hospital,
Oh,
and they were
wow.
all people of color. Now, I don't think it was racist intent, but it certainly was racist in its effect.
Mm-hmm.
Just because these people didn't go to Duke doesn't mean they don't deserve hospital care
Right.
before, after me. So that was really hard for me, and something that I'm still processing with the book is how do we address, systemic racism in healthcare systems, systemic racism in mental health, um,
Mm.
because mental health, especially in the South, in impoverished counties and even in urban centers, is is bad. There's no other word for it. It's just bad. So I'm hoping to address that, or at least scratch the surface in some of the book and talk about my own experience. But I'm speaking across the country, doing a lot of good work. Hopefully, trying to dismantle some of the structures that have been in place for so long.
Mm. I really appreciate that. Like as you continue to share, I just hear this commitment in your life to really work against those systems and structures that have not only affected you, but disproportionately affect Black people and people of color. And I feel like, and that's honestly one of the reasons I wanted to talk to you, is because I know that this is something that, we say all the time, is that it's white people's responsibility to confront white supremacy. But it seems like, a lot of people don't even know what the first step in doing that is. So, just as we wrap it up, I wonder if you could say to someone, someone says to you, like, I'm a white person, I keep hearing that it's my responsibility, I care, I want to do something, I don't know what I'm supposed to do. Where am I supposed to start? What would you say to them?
I think the first step comes in an acknowledgement that you don't know it all. Because we spend our lives as white people thinking we have it figured out, thinking we know everything about everybody's experience because we're a lot like them. And we are a lot like you in some ways, but we're different too, not only in experience, but in feelings. And, we're different, and we have to acknowledge that difference as a gift and not as a curse. So it comes in this willingness to say, you know what, I don't have it figured out. I'd like to listen. And then in time, you slowly start to gain vocabulary and the ability to speak to these issues, but also trying to remember that you're a lightning rod, not not the center of attention. You're supposed to take the heat for other people. You're not supposed to be the center of it all. So I see ourselves, white people, starting out as listeners, but also as lightning rods.
Awesome. Well, where can people keep in touch with you and keep up with your work?
Yeah, the best place to keep in touch with me is Twitter, at RobLee4. And then as you mentioned, I have a book out now, which you can get it wherever books are sold. And I'd love for you to check that out and then tell me what you think of it on Twitter, as long as it's kind. If you didn't like it, you can keep the opinion. No, I'm just kidding. No, it was a labor of love, and I'd love to hear your opinion about it.
Well, Rob, thanks so much again for taking some time to chat with me. This has been such a great conversation. If you're listening, remember to check out Rob Lee's book, A Sin by Another Name. It's available everywhere books are sold.
No, it doesn't have to be. Doesn't have to be this way. Doesn't have to be. No, it doesn't have to be this way.
I mean, as I shared with y'all before we entered this interview, it was an interesting one for me to have heard, and I hope the same is true for you, because one of the biggest challenges I see within social transformation work, especially with people with privilege, and we'll make this even more specific, dealing with white folks, is people wanting to distance themselves from what their ancestors or foreparents have done. And what's fascinating about Rob is that's actually the antithesis of what he's doing. He's really leaning in and not even just interrogating his past, but taking ownership of the way that it's benefited him as a white man in this country and doing what he can to address it through his anti-racism work. And so I was grateful to see in real time. I mean, I've been following, Reverend Rob Lee's work for a number of years now, but it was cool to see in real time, as a part of our show, him owning oh no, wait, this is my heritage. This is my lineage. And I've got to wrestle with that. And I don't know how often that happens. I mean, many of us out here deal with non-famous or infamous ancestors having done things that have impacted the lives of people. And we don't do that wrestling, but here is this man is doing not only a wrestling, but a wrestling with a famous ancestry and doing it publicly.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. There's so many layers to that. Yeah.
No, they absolutely are. I mean, so I think coming out of that interview, like that's the first thing that struck me is like, wow, he's doing this and he's doing this in public, and that can serve as a modeling for people who have to wrestle with the tensions of things that have happened in their families.
Yeah, I think that's such an important point, especially because in my experience with talking with white people about racism, a lot of white Americans are running from the past. You know, they want to just move past it. They want to just get over it, you know.
Mm-hmm.
And here's someone who is looking it in the face. And I think that that
Mm-hmm.
is I'm hoping that that would be an inspiring example for the white folks that listen to this show to
Mm-hmm.
have that kind of modeled for them in public. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, because the reality is, this isn't just our past, this is our present. So
Hmm.
part of how, many people got to know who Rob Lee is because of Charlottesville, which wasn't that long ago. Y'all, this is like recent history.
Yeah. That's
When we were
2
looking
years ago,
at
right?
2 years ago, we're seeing people who are our age. And that's one thing that Rob like points out, that like, racism and white supremacy and desire and longing for Jim Crow, it's not like way back in yesteryear, it's in our faces now. And this is something that is a legacy carried out by people who are our age, because we saw people sitting, sitting in Charlottesville, Virginia, right? Like I've been to Charlottesville. It's a very quaint town, but
Hmm.
standing there with torches, like this isn't like, the turn of the century in the 1900s. This was
Right.
2000 and what's that, 17?
Yeah. 2017.
2017, where people out there with torches in angry mob fashion surrounding churches and surrounding people who are calling out for racial justice.
Yeah. Yeah.
With generations in the past have seen it, and like people our age and older and younger, right? Like people of all generations have had to stand to fight. And for us, for you listeners, some of that standing, some of that solidarity work is about us reckoning with our past and the
Mm.
past of those who are a part of our familial lineages, or
Hmm.
sometimes that's even outside of our family, but it's like another lineage that we find ourselves affixed and attached to.
Hmm.
And so this was like really like a rich episode for me. But like Rob mentioned something, and like he mentioned something that it made me think of something. Basically, it made me think of generational responsibility, and that's what I
Yeah.
feel like that Rob Lee like represents, or what he's trying to engage in, is generational responsibility. And he speaks.
Absolutely.
Um, it was an indigenous principle that he raised, and like I went like online looking for it, like after I'd heard it, and
Uh-huh.
found this quotation from Oren Lyons, who's a faith keeper of the Turtle Clan of the Seneca and Onondaga nations,
Hmm.
that says, "The peacemaker taught us about the 7 generations. He said, when you sit in council for the welfare of the people, you must not think of yourself or of your family, not even of your generation. He said, make your decisions on behalf of the 7 generations coming, so
Mm.
that they may enjoy what you have today."
Wow.
And I mean, it's such wisdom, but it made me think about like 7 generations from now, like the things that I do, the things that I commit to. What does it mean to live beyond myself in the
Mm.
now, in order
Yeah.
for them to not just like enjoy things that I have, but to be able to take advantage of things that I haven't been able to take hold of myself?
Right. Right.
And, I think that Rob is definitely engaged in that work.
Hmm.
He's thinking about these generations to come. He understands, the generational work that was done in the past that is maybe, not maybe, but has definitely unfairly benefited him, like him being someone who bears white privilege,
Yeah.
because of the white supremacy that his ancestor, like his personal ancestor, has like, worked for.
Hmm.
Um, but he understands that like he can do something different, and
Yes.
work to right things, so that people set over generations to come, or generations to come, we don't have to put a numeric attachment on it, but the people in the future have the ability to be able to experience something different, to experience a different sort of reality.
Yeah. Oh, that's so powerful. Like, because I think that oftentimes when we talk about this stuff, it's like I can never know what like the person who's talking with me, what is really going on inside of them, right? But I can only go off of what they say. And the things that
Mm-hmm.
are said often, though, make it sound like if we acknowledge this past, this history, that we've never fully ended or stopped, then, I'll be pegged as a racist forever, right? Or a white supremacist forever, or, whatever. Like if we say that, you are someone who carries white privilege because of this, that, the other, then that's all they'll ever be, you know?
Mm-hmm.
And what you said was so powerful is to think that like, no, like you can be the person in your family that says, well, it stops with me, you know, we're going to do something different.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Like, I wonder like what those things are, right? Like when we reflect on our own histories, like what are the things that we're going to say that it stops with me for?
Mm.
Like, I know that's like a really big question, and it's not something I expect like you to answer or me to answer in immediacy, or even like you listeners, like for y'all to answer like on the spot. But I think that that's something for us to consider. Like, what are the things that have happened in the past that are part of our lineages, a part of our heritages, that we say, nah, like this is like I'm not going to let this go any further than me.
Yeah,
Like it stops here.
that's a good question. Mm-hmm.
And I think that that's something that like I think both of us can relate to, right? Like having backgrounds, complicated backgrounds, like with ministry and how like we frame ourselves as ministers or not, given the day. But like faith is a thing that I know that I see, and I know from our conversations that like you see that is political. Like when we look back at like, sacred texts, when we look back at like writings, and even just like the work that people have committed to over the millennia, like,
Mm-hmm.
and people who have identified themselves to be people of faith, yeah, justice work is at the core of it for many folks.
Yeah.
And so one of the things that you brought up actually in the interview with Rob, Andre, is somebody mentioned something to you about like Nazis and the role of the confessing church.
Yes. Yeah. Wait. Oh, I don't know. I mentioned that.
You
Yeah.
did.
Okay.
You did.
Okay. Yes. All right. I'm gonna let you finish your question though.
Okay. It was really interesting to see you bring that up, because it's like, yeah, no, like there were people who had a faithful witness who were concerned about Nazism and the rise of fascism and the execution
Yeah.
of Jews who were present at that time. And it didn't stop.
Right.
It didn't stop
Yeah.
anything.
Right. Right.
And that's like a hard thing to hold in tension. It's like, yeah, we're out here like working to give people hope, obviously, like alongside these hard pills. But like, name drop.
Well,
But that's a thing that we got to wrestle with. That's
right.
tense.
I don't know that inviting Mr. Christian Racist into a theological conversation is actually going to be helpful, because I don't think that Mr. Christian Racist is actually interested in theology. I think that at the end of the day, what Mr. Christian Racist is interested in is Donald Trump being president, and he'll take any story that he can, grab onto to legitimate that situation.
Mm-hmm.
So that's why I asked that question. So I brought that up when I was talking with Rob, is because I was in a conversation with a president of a seminary who
Mm-hmm.
brought up that idea of the confessing church. I say all
Mm-hmm.
that to say, I don't actually know that much about what the confessing church actually did.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if they organized, I don't know if they tried to organize mass, nonviolent struggle, or what they tried to do, or if they tried to stage a direct political intervention against fascism and Nazism. I don't know that. So I will say that I think that, I'll say it this way. My hope, my belief in people power and in the power of strategic nonviolent struggle remains strong, whether it's faith-based or not. And I think that Christian communities, faith communities of any sort, that they have these amazing resources to organize and mobilize people power if they'll use it wisely. But I don't know that like actually arguing theology alone with people who are using bad or toxic theology I don't know if that actually makes a difference.
I mean, I also don't know if it's the best use of time, to be honest with you. It's like you sitting here like seriously, it's like you're sitting here like arguing over like theory when people are actually dying. Like, I
Yeah.
think about the immense privilege that lies in that, right? To like be in a place where you can pontificate about the implications of whatever. And it's just like, no, like Shorty over there is like starving, or like, to bring back some of that imagery that we were talking about in Charlottesville, they're marching with torches, like, and surrounding
Right.
places, and people don't know if they're going to make it out of a place alive. So for us to sit here and talk about
Right.
like, blah, 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 sanctification and how that, what? Like it really, and it's not at all it's not at all, don't get me wrong, to minimize the role of theologies and unpacking theologies. But like, it's like, how do we unpack this?
Yeah.
When do we? And what also needs to be happening alongside this? Because I mean, the thing that came up for me, like thinking about like what you were sharing and like the conversation that you and Rob were having, is whether or not better theologies are enough to create the world, or create a world in which we're all truly free, or do we need other tools and resources? And I don't think
Hmm.
that theology alone is it. Like the way that we conceptualize God and the divine, that's not enough. I mean, I think it can play into something, but there are other pieces of the puzzle that have to come into play. I'm just not
Hmm.
100% sure what all of those tools might
Yeah.
be.
And maybe this is a conversation for another episode, but like, what's the goal? Do you try to get the perpetrators of religious violence to stop, or are you more focused on those who are harmed by the religious violence to get them to a safe place and to have them experience restoration and healing?
Mhm.
And I'm assuming that it's definitely some kind of both and. Um, but yeah, that just is really interesting to me.
The field itself is developing, even though the work has been happening like since forever. There are people who've been speaking about violences of different sorts, right? Like, so you have, womanists who for the longest time were speaking about like, the violences that took place like within like religious spaces. You have like, folks working towards like theologies, and not even just theologies, but also like social phenomena from like a number of perspectives who've been talking about this. But like now there's like an emerging field. I mean, like, it's only within the last like few years that we have something to describe some of like language like in the health field, the mental health field, to describe some of this. So like
Hmm.
religious trauma syndrome is something that's being spoken about of more and more. Most of the conversations, and this is where I nerd out a little bit, most of the conversations are taking place in Europe. They're doing a little bit more work around that than we're doing here in the States. But there definitely are more people who are speaking about things like religious violence, sacramental shame, and they're coming from
Right.
like different fields because it's interdisciplinary in nature. So it's not just theologians who are doing this work, it's theologians and philosophers and sociologists and increasingly, hopefully soon, more political scientists who are going to be speaking about this, because
Right.
all of these things are working together to not only like impact cultures like within like religious spaces, but like kind of more broadly, like especially in the US context where like religion is as big as it is. Um
Right.
yeah, like it's a cultural thing,
Hmm.
and we have to address it. But I think addressing in that term specifically could be an interesting one to maybe exit on. I mean, we've talked about, generational violences and like working to like do things in our immediacy to
Hmm.
be able to put future generations in a better position. But that requires us doing work, whether it is that we experience marginalization or we inhabit spaces of privilege. Um, and so, two of my final questions to our listeners deal with that. So, one is, how are you working to acknowledge and address the guilt you deal with because of your privilege? Guilt is a thing that definitely came up in your conversation with
Hmm.
Rob. And one of the things that you said, which I also hold to be true, is that as people of color and specifically Black folks, it's not our responsibility to help white people like wrestle with their guilt, but people do need to deal with their guilt in order to like continue to commit to the work of social transformation, because too often it's one of those things that cause people to stall out. So yeah, like, how are folks working to acknowledge and address the guilt that they deal with because of their privileges? But conversely, those of us, or maybe complexly, because you can occupy privilege and marginalization in the same personhood. But for those of us who do experience marginalization, how are you working to address and acknowledge the grief that you deal with because of said marginalization? I mean, these are difficult questions to wrestle through, but I hope that you do this wrestling. And, for those who experience, privilege and marginalization in the same body, many of us do. How are you wrestling, with guilt and with grief? Because both of those things do come up for us. So we know that we've left you with a lot to think about, but thank you for joining us for another episode of the Hope and Hard Pills podcast. We look forward to connecting with you soon.
Okay, bye!
Really? I cannot with you, Andre.
We're not living in your fantasy. Your Daffy Duck and your Bugs Bunny. Wearing clothes that we cannot.
Thank you for listening today. If you like what you heard and you haven't already, please subscribe on your favorite podcatcher. Leaving a rating or review on Apple Podcasts also helps us get into more ears and minds. This podcast is made possible by our fantastic patrons. Thank you for being a part of our work at Hope and Hard Pills. As usual, you'll get the uncut extended version of this episode on Patreon. If you want to join in on the work on our Patreon community, just look us up at patreon.com/Andre Henry. To go deeper, get subscribed to our email newsletter. Head over to andrerhenry.com and click Join the Movement, where you'll get practical insight on anti-racism and social change every week. And you'll never miss a new article, song, or podcast episode. You can also follow Andre Henry on Facebook and Instagram at @TheAndreHenry. Connect with Alicia on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at Alicia T. Crosby and her website, aliciatcrosby.com. That's all for this episode of the Hope and Hard Pills podcast. See you next time. Peace.